My name is Paula, and I stood paralyzed in the living room as my mother's funeral service finally ended. The silence in the house was heavy, but it was not caused by grief, because my stepfather Richard and stepsister Sabrina were already discussing the sale of our home. They spoke about property values with a casual indifference that made my stomach turn, while I was still wiping tears from my face. Before I tell you how a single torn photo destroyed their entire plan, Richard looked at me with pure disdain while ordering me to clear out my mother's personal belongings immediately so he could list the house tomorrow morning. He spoke to me with the cold authority one might use for a disobedient servant rather than a stepdaughter who had just lost her mother. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I gathered her old clothes into boxes until I accidentally knocked a heavy picture frame off the dresser. The impact caused the backing to pop open, revealing a secret black and white photograph hidden behind the family portrait. I barely had a second to register the faces in the picture before Sabrina snatched it violently from my hands. Her face twisted into a mask of cruel mockery as she screamed the words I had feared the most. "Don't bother with this trash." She ripped the vintage photograph into tiny, jagged pieces right before my eyes and tossed them carelessly into the nearest trash can, like they were nothing. Richard wasted no time in delivering the final blow by pointing toward the front door with a terrifying calmness. "Pack your things and get out now." I was forced out into the cold night with nothing but a small bag of clothes because they wanted to erase every trace of my existence. However, they made a critical mistake, because I managed to reach into that garbage bin and retrieve the torn fragments of the photo before I left. That destroyed picture was the only thing I had left of my mother Helen. My instincts told me that this secret image was the key to understanding why they hated us so much. 1 hour after being kicked out of the house, I stood outside the door of my best friend Brenda, who was the only person in the world I could turn to at such a late hour. She opened the door immediately upon hearing my frantic knocking and pulled me inside without asking a single question about my sudden appearance or the meager belongings in my hand. Brenda made me a cup of hot tea and sat with me in silence while my shaking hands slowly returned to a steady state. The warmth of her small apartment provided a stark contrast to the cold hostility I had just escaped at my former home, allowing me to finally breathe after the suffocation of the funeral. I sat there for a long time staring at the steam rising from the mug, while trying to process the absolute cruelty Richard and Sabrina had displayed only an hour ago. Once I felt calm enough to speak, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled handful of paper scraps I had salvaged from the trash can. I spread the jagged fragments across Brenda's kitchen table under the dim yellow light of the overhead fixture. Brenda watched me with deep concern, but helped me find a roll of clear tape so I could begin the tedious task of reconstruction. I spent the next hour carefully aligning the torn edges because I knew this destroyed image was the only clue I had left regarding my mother's hidden past. My fingers worked with precision to match the ripped lines of the background and the faces slowly piecing together a story that had been literally torn apart. When the last piece was finally taped into place, the image that stared back at me was so shocking that I actually gasped aloud in the quiet room. The woman in the photograph was undeniably my mother, yet she looked nothing like the tired and overworked woman I had known all my life. She was wearing a tailored business suit that looked incredibly expensive, and her posture exuded a sense of confidence and authority I had never seen in her before. She was not the submissive woman who cowered before Richard, but rather someone who looked like she commanded respect from everyone around her. Standing right next to her was a distinguished man I did not recognize, and they were posing in front of a massive glass building with a very specific stylized S logo in the background. My years working in warehouse management allowed me to instantly identify that distinctive logo as the trademark of Sterling Logistics. It was one of the largest transportation conglomerates in Michigan, and a company that dominated the local industry where I had spent my entire career. The realization made my heart pound because Mom had always told me she worked there strictly as a janitor who mopped floors during the night shift. However, the woman in this photograph looked like she owned the building rather than someone who cleaned it for minimum wage. The discrepancy between what I was seeing and what I had been told my entire life was too significant to ignore. I urgently asked to borrow Brenda's laptop because I needed to confirm the identity of the man standing so familiarly beside my mother. I typed the company name into the search bar and scrolled through the image results until I found a match for the silver-haired man in the picture. The search results identified him as Arthur Sterling, the legendary founder of the corporation and a billionaire known for his reclusive nature in recent years. I sat back in the chair while trying to process the impossibility of what I was looking at on the screen. My mother, who supposedly scrubbed toilets to put food on our table, was standing shoulder to shoulder with one of the wealthiest men in the state. A wave of intense suspicion washed over me as I connected the dots between this photograph and the violent reaction from Richard and Sabrina earlier that evening. It made no sense for them to be so terrified of a simple picture unless it held a secret they were desperate to keep buried forever. If my mother was truly just a janitor, there would be no reason for Richard to order me out of the house the moment this photo was discovered. They were hiding something massive, and this taped-together image was the proof they thought they had destroyed. I looked at the date stamp on the back of the reassembled photo and realized it was taken 15 years ago, right before everything in our lives had changed for the worse. I realized then that finding a new apartment or a job would have to wait, because solving this mystery was now my only priority. I turned to Brenda and told her that I was not going to look for warehouse work the next morning as I had originally planned. Instead of hunting for a shift, I was going to drive straight to the old headquarters of Sterling Logistics to find out who my mother really was. I folded the repaired photograph carefully and placed it in my wallet, knowing it was my ticket to the truth and potentially the weapon I needed to fight back against Richard. I closed my eyes on Brenda's couch with a newfound determination replacing my grief, ready to confront whatever secrets lay behind those glass doors. The next morning, I parked my old sedan outside the towering glass building of Sterling Logistics. The structure loomed over the busy city street like a fortress of steel and reflection, making my rusted vehicle look completely out of place among the luxury cars lining the executive reserved spots. I took a deep breath to steady my nerves before stepping out of the car, clutching the worn leather wallet that contained the taped-up photograph of my mother. I walked toward the revolving doors with as much confidence as I could muster, but my worn-out sneakers and thrift store jacket immediately drew the attention of the security personnel stationed in the lobby. I had barely taken 3 steps onto the polished marble floor when a stern guard blocked my path with a look of practiced dismissal. He informed me in a flat monotone that I could not enter the premises without an official appointment or a valid employee badge, treating me like a nuisance that needed to be removed to preserve the corporate image. I tried to explain that I only wanted to ask a few simple questions about a former employee, but he cut me off before I could even finish my sentence. He pointed toward the exit with a rigid finger and told me to clear the area immediately, or he would be forced to call the police for trespassing. I retreated to the sidewalk, feeling a familiar sense of humiliation, but the burning questions in my mind would not allow me to simply drive away. I decided to wait near the designated smoking area on the side of the building where I could observe the employees coming and going without alerting the security guard again. I stood there for nearly 2 hours watching the stream of young professionals in sharp suits who looked too young to have been there 15 years ago. I needed to find someone with gray hair and the weary posture of a veteran who might remember the history of this place. My patience finally paid off when the automatic doors slid open to reveal an older man with thinning white hair and a lanyard that identified him as an archive employee named Henderson. He walked with a slow shuffle toward a concrete bench and pulled out a pack of cigarettes with hands that shook slightly from age. I waited until he had lit his cigarette before I approached him cautiously, trying not to startle him in the middle of his break. I introduced myself quickly and apologized for the intrusion before pulling the reconstructed photo from my wallet and holding it out for him to see. I watched his eyes scan the jagged lines of the tape and the black and white faces with a casual disinterest that vanished the moment he recognized the woman standing next to the founder. He froze with his cigarette halfway to his mouth and leaned closer to the image as if he was seeing a ghost from a forgotten era. His eyes widened behind his thick glasses, and he looked up at me with an expression of absolute disbelief that sent a chill down my spine. "My God, is that Helen? Where did you find this? We thought she vanished off the face of the earth." His reaction confirmed everything I had suspected since the night before, but hearing her name spoken with such recognition made my knees feel weak. I swallowed the lump in my throat and looked at this stranger who obviously knew the version of my mother that had been hidden from me my entire life. I needed him to clarify the lie that Richard had fed me since childhood, so I asked him the question that had been haunting me. "Please, sir, my mother told me she was a janitor here. Is that true?" Henderson looked at me as if I had just told a ridiculous joke, and then he let out a short, incredulous laugh that carried no humor. He shook his head vigorously while handing the photo back to me, with a newfound sense of reverence. He told me that calling Helen a janitor was like calling the sun a candle, because she had been the executive vice president of the entire corporation. He explained that 15 years ago, she was the right hand of Arthur Sterling and the brilliant mind behind the logistics strategies that built this empire. She was the most powerful woman in the company until the day she suddenly cleared out her office and disappeared without a proper goodbye. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow because it meant that our entire life of poverty had been a fabrication orchestrated by Richard. My mother had not been a helpless cleaner scraping by on minimum wage. She had been a corporate titan who was erased from history. Henderson saw the shock on my face and quickly pulled a small notepad from his pocket to scribble down an address in hasty, jagged handwriting. He tore the page out and pressed it into my hand, telling me that I needed to go there immediately because Arthur Sterling had never stopped looking for answers about why his partner left. He urged me to show the chairman the photo because the old man was the only person left who could unlock the full truth of what happened 15 years ago. I thanked him breathless and ran back to my car, clutching the piece of paper that led to the next chapter of this dark mystery. 2 hours later, I stood nervously in front of the massive iron gates of the Sterling estate. The imposing black metal bars seemed to separate my world of struggle from a universe of unimaginable wealth that my mother had apparently once known intimately. I pressed the intercom button repeatedly until a crackling voice demanded to know my business with a tone of irritation that matched the security guard from earlier. I knew that simply stating my name would mean nothing to the staff inside, so I leaned close to the speaker and shouted the only name that mattered. I screamed that I was the daughter of Helen and that I had proof of who she really was. There was a long silence that felt like an eternity before the heavy gates began to swing open with a slow mechanical groan that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. A stern butler met me at the front entrance and escorted me through a hallway that was larger than the entire house I had just been kicked out of. He led me into a dim library where an elderly man sat in a motorized wheelchair, facing a large window that overlooked the manicured gardens. Arthur Sterling turned his wheelchair around slowly, and I saw a man who had been aged by time, but possessed eyes that remained startlingly sharp and intelligent. The moment his gaze landed on my face, his expression collapsed from polite curiosity into a look of absolute heartbreak. He whispered my mother's name with a trembling voice because the resemblance between us at this age must have been overwhelming for him. He wheeled himself closer with urgency, and his hands shook as he reached out toward me without actually touching me. I approached him slowly and placed the taped-up photograph on the mahogany desk that separated us to bridge the gap between our two worlds. Arthur reached out with a hand spotted by age and traced the jagged lines where Sabrina had torn the image apart only the night before. A single tear rolled down his cheek as he looked at the younger version of himself standing proudly beside the woman he had clearly respected and perhaps even loved like a daughter. He looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and sorrow before asking why Helen had never returned to say goodbye to him personally. I told him that I did not know the answer, and that was exactly why I had come to him for the truth. Arthur took a deep breath and began to recount the events of 15 years ago with a clarity that was both impressive and painful. He told me that my stepfather Richard had come to this very office with a stack of medical files and a signed power of attorney document. He described how Richard had sat in the chair I was currently standing next to and wept fake tears about my mother's declining health. Richard told me Helen was dying. He said she wanted to sell her shares immediately to pay for treatment and move to the countryside for peace. I felt the blood drain from my face as his words sank in because they contradicted every single moment of my childhood. Richard had painted a picture of a tragic woman seeking solace while the reality was a woman trapped in a nightmare of his making. I realized that my mother had likely been coerced or threatened into signing those papers, while Richard painted a tragic picture to her boss. I shook my head violently as tears began to stream down my face at the injustice of his lie. "We never saw any money, Mr. Sterling. Mom worked 2 jobs until the day she died. We lived in poverty because she was terrified of him." Arthur gripped the armrests of his wheelchair so hard that his knuckles turned white as he processed my revelation. He explained that he had liquidated her shares immediately because he wanted to help her in her final days without asking any difficult questions. He told me that he had transferred $2 million into a specialized trust fund that Richard claimed was for my future education and well-being. The money was supposed to be a safety net for me after my mother passed away from her alleged illness. The realization that Richard had stolen 15 years of our lives and millions of dollars hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. His expression shifted from deep sorrow to a terrifying cold rage that reminded me of the powerful CEO he used to be. He realized that for 15 years he had been sending money to a man who was enslaving the very people the funds were meant to protect. He looked at the taped photograph one last time before looking at me with a determination that promised violence. He swore to me in that quiet library that Richard would pay for every single lie he had told and every penny he had stolen from us. The following afternoon, I sat in the conference room of Arthur's private law firm. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense, as a team of high-powered attorneys sifted through mountains of paperwork that documented 15 years of systematic theft. Arthur sat at the head of the long mahogany table with a grim expression while his legal team dissected the fraudulent transfer of shares that had destroyed my mother's life. They had spent the entire morning pulling archived files from the county clerk and the bank to reconstruct the timeline of Richard's deception. A forensic document examiner projected a magnified image of the stock transfer agreement onto the wall for everyone to see clearly. He used a laser pointer to highlight the shaky curvature of the signature that purported to be my mother's authorization. He explained with absolute certainty that the signature was a clumsy forgery because the ink distribution showed hesitation marks where the forger had paused to trace over a previous model. The realization that Richard had physically forged her name while she was likely sick or intimidated made my blood boil with a mixture of rage and grief. The head attorney then placed a heavy binder containing hundreds of pages of bank statements directly in front of me with a heavy sigh. He opened it to the very first page, which dated back to the month Richard had visited Arthur's estate 15 years ago. The documents revealed the existence of the Paula Trust Fund, an account I had never heard of, but one that had held over $2 million of Arthur's money. The lawyer looked at me with a sympathetic expression before delivering the legal reality of my situation. "Technically, the fund is in your name, Paula, but Richard listed himself as the sole guardian with unrestricted withdrawal rights. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I began to turn the pages of the financial history that Richard had hidden from us. The statements read like a diary of Sabrina's privileged life, funded entirely by the money that was supposed to protect me from poverty. I saw transaction after transaction for things that I could only dream of while I was working double shifts at the warehouse just to pay for community college. There were withdrawals for a brand new convertible for Sabrina's 16th birthday, followed by tuition payments for an elite private high school that cost more than I made in a year. I saw charges for designer jewelry, tropical vacations for Richard and Sabrina, and even the down payment on the luxury condo Sabrina currently rented downtown. While I was taking out student loans that would cripple me for decades, Richard was draining my inheritance to give his biological daughter a life of royalty. The injustice was so profound that I had to close the binder to stop myself from screaming in the middle of the quiet conference room. Arthur was shaking with fury as he listened to the litany of expenses, his face turning a dangerous shade of red as he realized the extent of the betrayal. He slammed his hand on the table and demanded that his lawyers call the district attorney immediately to have Richard arrested within the hour. However, I reached out and placed my hand gently on Arthur's arm to stop him from making the call just yet. I told him that an immediate arrest was too good for a man like Richard because he would just deny everything and claim it was a misunderstanding until the very end. I wanted something more than just a police escort. I wanted to see the hope drain from his eyes the moment he realized he had lost everything. I explained to Arthur that Richard was scheduled to sign the final papers for the sale of our old house early next week. He was convinced that the sale would be his final victory, the last bit of cash he could squeeze out of my mother's legacy before moving on to his new life. I proposed a plan that would turn his moment of triumph into a public execution of his character and his freedom. I wanted to catch him in the act of trying to sell property that technically belonged to me, surrounded by the very people he tried to impress. It would be the perfect stage for the man in the photo to make his grand entrance and close the book on Richard's lies forever. Arthur listened to my strategy, and a slow, cold smile spread across his face as he agreed to wait for the trap to spring. 1 week after the funeral, I returned to the house that used to be my home. The familiar driveway was now occupied by a luxury sedan that belonged to a wealthy couple who were currently inspecting the property with enthusiastic smiles. I parked my rusted car across the street and took a deep breath to steady my nerves because I knew that this performance had to be perfect. I walked up the pathway with my shoulders slumped and my head down to project the image of a defeated woman who had lost everything. Through the large bay window, I could see Richard and Sabrina laughing with the potential buyers while pointing out the features of the living room that my mother had worked so hard to maintain. They were dressed in expensive new clothes that were undoubtedly purchased with the funds Richard had been draining from my trust account for years. I knocked hesitatingly on the front door and waited until the laughter inside died down before the door swung open to reveal my stepsister. Sabrina was wearing a designer dress that cost more than my car, and her face twisted into a sneer the moment she recognized me standing on the porch. She did not even try to lower her voice as she leaned against the doorframe to block my entry with her body. "Look who crawled back. Did you run out of dumpsters to sleep in, Paula?" I forced myself to swallow the insult without reacting, because I needed them to believe that I was truly broken and desperate. I looked past her shoulder to see Richard approaching with a glass of champagne in his hand and an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. I kept my voice trembling and low as I begged them for just 5 minutes to collect a few worthless trinkets from my mother's old jewelry box. The buyers looked uncomfortable at the family drama unfolding in the doorway, which prompted Richard to step outside and close the door behind him to maintain his facade of respectability. Richard looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, as if I were a stray animal that kept returning to a house where it was not wanted. He clearly enjoyed seeing me in this state of apparent destitution because it validated his belief that he and Sabrina were superior beings who deserved their stolen fortune. I decided that this was the moment to strike at his massive ego, so I looked him directly in the eyes with a flash of defiance that I knew would provoke him. I asked him quietly why my mother had died in poverty if she had truly been an executive at Sterling Logistics as the photo suggested. The question hit its mark perfectly because Richard's face flushed with a sudden flash of anger at my insolence. He grabbed my arm roughly and pulled me closer so that the buyers inside the house would not hear his venomous words. He needed to crush this last bit of hope in me because his narcissism would not allow him to let me think I had discovered his secret. He leaned down until his lips were brushing against my ear and whispered the confession that would seal his fate forever. Your mother was a fool just like you. I forged her name, took her money, and she was too scared to do anything about it. He pulled back with a satisfied grin to see the devastation on my face, but he failed to notice the cold calculation in my eyes. He had no idea that the silver ballpoint pen clipped securely to the front pocket of my jacket was actually a high-fidelity recording device provided by Arthur's legal team. The tiny microphone inside had captured every syllable of his admission with crystal-clear audio quality that would stand up in any court of law. I took a deliberate step back from him and allowed a slow smile to spread across my face, which caused his triumphant expression to falter slightly. I did not say another word as I turned around and walked back toward the street, while Richard stared at my retreating back in confusion. He shook his head dismissively and turned back to the house to sign the sale contract that he believed would fund his new life. He reached for the door handle with the confidence of a man who had won the game without realizing that he had just handed me the key to his destruction. Just as Richard reached for the pen to sign the sale contract, chaos erupted. The quiet suburban afternoon was violently shattered by the deafening wail of sirens that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. I watched from the sidewalk as two police cruisers screeched to a halt directly in front of the driveway to effectively block any possible escape route for Richard's luxury sedan. The flashing red and blue lights painted the front of the house in a chaotic rhythm that terrified the potential buyers inside. The front door, which Richard had just closed with such arrogance, was thrown open with a force that startled everyone in the living room. Arthur Sterling entered the entryway with the commanding presence of a general leading an army flanked immediately by Detective Briggs and a team of uniformed officers. The sight of the legendary billionaire entering our modest home was surreal enough to freeze the entire room in stunned silence. Richard looked up from the contract and his face drained of all color until he looked like a corpse, standing upright. The expensive fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor as he locked eyes with the man he had deceived for 15 years. The arrogance that had defined him just moments ago evaporated instantly when he realized that the man in the photo was no longer a ghost from the past, but a very real threat standing in his living room. He backed away until he hit the wall and stammered out words that were barely coherent in his panic. Mr. Sterling, but I thought you never leave your estate. Detective Briggs did not give him time to recover from the shock as he stepped forward with a folded document in his hand. He announced in a booming voice that echoed through the house that Richard was under immediate arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, forgery of legal documents, and the embezzlement of a trust fund worth millions of dollars. The buyers, who had been moments away from purchasing the property, gasped in horror and quickly moved to the far side of the room to distance themselves from the criminal standing before them. Richard tried to open his mouth to form a defense, but no sound came out because the weight of his crimes had finally crushed him. Sabrina realized that her life of privilege was collapsing around her, and she let out a high-pitched scream of terror. She shoved past the confused real estate agent and made a desperate dash toward the kitchen in a foolish attempt to escape through the back door. However, a female officer was already waiting for her and tackled her before she could even reach the handle. As the cold metal cuffs clicked around her wrists, Sabrina began to sob hysterically and shouted that she knew nothing about the money while screaming that her father was the only one to blame. It was pathetic to watch how quickly she turned on the man who had spoiled her simply to save her own skin. I walked slowly back into the house and stood directly between Richard and the police officers with the recording device in my hand. The room fell silent again as I pressed the playback button and turned the volume up so that every person in the room could hear the truth. Richard's own voice filled the air with his arrogant confession about forging my mother's signature and stealing her money because she was too scared to stop him. The recording was the final nail in his coffin because it stripped away any defense he might have concocted about being innocent or misunderstood. Arthur looked at Richard with a gaze of pure contempt and told him that he would spend the rest of his life paying for what he did to Helen. The officers grabbed Richard by the arms and hauled him out the front door while neighbors gathered on their lawns to watch the spectacle. He hung his head in absolute shame as he was shoved into the back of the police car, marking the end of the 15 years he had spent living like a king on the suffering of my mother and me. I stood on the porch next to Arthur and felt a profound sense of relief wash over me as the police cars drove away. The nightmare that had begun with a torn photograph was finally over, and for the first time in my life, I felt the heavy burden of my mother's secret lift from my shoulders. The justice she had been denied in life had finally been served, and the man who had tormented us was gone forever. 1 month after the trial, I stood alone in the newly renovated living room. The heavy velvet curtains that Richard had installed to make the house look aristocratic were gone, replaced by sheer linen that let the afternoon sunlight flood the space for the first time in years. The legal proceedings had moved with astonishing speed because the audio recording of Richard's confession left his defense team with absolutely no room to maneuver. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, sentencing Richard to 20 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Sabrina fared no better as the court stripped her of every asset she owned, forcing her to move into a halfway house while serving her sentence of 3,000 hours of community service. I officially regained full ownership of the house and the remaining balance of the trust fund, along with a significant restitution payment derived from the liquidation of Richard's luxury cars and hidden accounts. I decided to strip the house down to its bones to remove the lingering stench of their greed, starting with the master bedroom where my mother had spent her final years in sorrow. While the contractors were ripping up the rotten floorboards near the window, one of the workers called me over to inspect a strange object resting between the support beams. It was a small rusted metal box that had been deliberately wedged into the darkness, covered in dust and forgotten by everyone except the woman who placed it there. I took the box to the kitchen and pried the lid open with a screwdriver, my heart pounding as I recognized my mother's handwriting on a folded piece of yellowed notebook paper inside. The letter was dated 15 years ago, written just days after she had supposedly resigned from her position at Sterling Logistics due to illness. I sat on the floor and began to read the shaky script that finally explained the mystery of her silence and her terrified submission. My mother wrote that Richard had discovered her connection to Arthur and threatened to stage a fatal accident involving me if she ever tried to contact him or the police. She described in agonizing detail how he had cornered her in the kitchen and promised that he would hurt me, her only child, if she did not sign over her shares and allow him to control the money. I pressed the letter to my chest and wept uncontrollably as the weight of her sacrifice crashed down on me. I had spent years resenting her for being weak, for letting him walk all over us, and for never standing up for herself. I finally understood that her silence was not cowardice, but the strongest shield she could forge to keep me alive. She had endured 15 years of emotional abuse, poverty, and humiliation, solely to ensure that Richard would not harm a single hair on my head. The poverty we lived in was the ransom she paid every single day for my safety, and she had taken that secret to her grave to protect me until the very end. A few days after discovering the letter, I received 2 envelopes from the state penitentiary addressed to me in familiar handwriting. Richard had written a long, rambling letter begging for forgiveness, claiming that he had only wanted the best for the family, and asking me to speak to the judge about a sentence reduction. Sabrina's letter was filled with excuses blaming her father for everything and asking if I could send her money because she was struggling to survive on her own. I did not feel a shred of pity as I walked over to the fireplace where a warm fire was crackling in the grate. I tossed both unopened letters into the flames and watched as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, taking their toxic influence out of my life forever. I used a large portion of the recovered inheritance to establish the Helen Scholarship, in partnership with Arthur Sterling, dedicated to helping single mothers who wanted to pursue careers in business and logistics. I stood next to Arthur at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the foundation, feeling a sense of peace that I had not known existed. I had lost my mother to a monster, but I had found her truth in the debris he left behind. I was finally free to live the life she had sacrificed everything to give me, and I knew she was watching over me with pride. The most profound lesson from this story is that justice may be delayed by the machinations of greedy people, but it can never be permanently denied. Richard and Sabrina believed they could bury their crimes under layers of lies and intimidation, yet a single torn photograph was enough to unravel their entire empire of deceit. It reminds us that truth is resilient and will always find a way to surface often when the perpetrators feel most secure in their wrongdoing. Furthermore, we learn that a mother's love is the most powerful force in the world, capable of enduring unimaginable suffering for the sake of her child. Helen's choice to remain silent and endure a life of poverty was not a sign of weakness, but a heroic act of protection to save Paula from a dangerous man. Her sacrifice teaches us that true strength is often quiet, invisible, and born out of a selfless desire to keep our loved ones safe at any cost. Thank you so much for listening to Paula's journey from heartbreak to justice. It means the world to me that you stayed